All right, short fiction. For some reason, this is like my most requested video. At least it has been for the last 6 months or so. I'm finally filming it. The main reason that I was kind of putting off making this video was that I felt like I kind of wanted to make sure that I knew what my process was before saying like, hey, this is my process, you know? Is this lighting okay? Let's turn on an extra light in here. I always love a good green moment. No? Red, orange, I don't know. A couple more disclaimers. I write like 99% of the time speculative fiction, mostly science fiction and fantasy. I'll try to tailor this to just general writing advice. I honestly didn't really write any short fiction up until I kind of wrote it a little bit in high school, but like not seriously. I was introduced to like the art of a short story in university when I was taking creative writing workshop. And that's kind of when I really learned like how to sort of structure a short story and the different ways to approach it in a more formal setting. But even then, I felt like I was never confident about my process until I want to say like 2-ish years ago is when I really started dipping my toes into like really want to refine my short stories. I've kind of split up the framework into like 3 to 4 basic steps, but these aren't meant to be like in any particular order. I think some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today also will apply to novels too, but I'm just going to be discussing examples in the context of short fiction. With all that said, let's dive into it, starting with world, setting, and atmosphere. I'm kind of grouping this all together. Obviously, an initial idea for a story is going to come from anywhere. For me, it is often world and setting. It's funny because I think with my short stories, I tend to get ideas based on like a world idea first, but with my novels, it always tends to be character first. I don't know why. That's just how my brain works. If you're writing like a speculative piece, I guess the first question for you will be, what genre are you writing? If you're not necessarily writing something that's like fantasy or sci-fi, I think you'll still have to ask yourself, what is the setting of the story? So when I'm brainstorming a world, I like to get as specific as possible. Of course, you don't have as much time to flesh out a world in a shorter piece usually. So you might be thinking, isn't that all the more reason that my world can be vague and that I don't need to flesh things out? And the answer is yes and no. It depends on what kind of story you're writing. However, I do think this is where considering atmosphere comes into play. For example, if you decide I'm writing a fantasy story, you then have to figure out like, okay, what kind of fantasy story? Is it folklore? Fairy tale, mythology adjacent, or is it contemporary? Does it take place in a rural American town in the 90s? Does it take place in a big city in 2095? Does it take place in the real world? Even if it does take place in modern day, there are a lot of different subcultures that you could be writing within, you know? Or if it's sci-fi, is it post-apocalyptic? Are we on planet Earth? If we're not on planet Earth, are the characters even human? Are they humans interacting with other species? What does that look like? In modern day, you know, are we in a corporate workplace? Are we in college? Are we backpacking across Europe during a midlife crisis? You know what I mean? What kind of crisis is it? And where is that crisis leading us? I think to make a world feel really lived in, especially in a short amount of time, it helps to go as deep and specific as possible and think about your genre, not just on a surface level. I think the deeper you go, the more nuanced your story will feel so that everything isn't so one-dimensional. For example, so I have a short story that is coming out this month. Is it this month? I've mentioned it a million times on this channel. It's called Sway With Me Until We Bleed. It is a science fiction piece, but specifically it's cyberpunk. And even more specifically, it's about a very specific cultural issue that could arise in a cyberpunk world. It's about the evolution of the entertainment industry as a result of the development of certain technologies in a society that would lack proper regulations. And that got my gears turning on themes of exploitation of talent and dude, I freaking hate this word. Fetishization? fetishization of celebrities and parasocial relationships and refracting that through a cyberpunk lens. So I go as deep as I possibly can in a world. That's what is going to really make a reader believe that this world is real for the period of time that they're reading the short story. A piece of feedback that I was really surprised and really happy to get on Sway With Me, and this is the reason that I ended up submitting this piece, because if you don't know, Sway With Me is the first short story that I ever submitted to any magazine. And I think the one thing that gave me the confidence booster to submit it is that I started getting the same feedback from beta readers, and then later on from the editor that I worked with at Augur. All used the same word to describe Sway With Me, which was cinematic. It was very reassuring to get that comment, because that was the atmosphere that I was always going for, but I never consciously realized that I was going for. It feels like you're peeking into one facet of a larger world, and so you feel as a reader that you're kind of gonna imagine the whole sprawl of this setting just laid out before you. And I think after years of figuring out, okay, how do I create that feeling? When you think about characters and you think about human beings being very fleshed out and, not one-dimensional, and they're not perfect, you got to bring that energy to your world building as well. A character walking down a street, they're not just walking down a street. What does the street look like? What does it feel like? And I think there's always room to squeeze some life in your descriptions, even if it's just one or two sentences. If you're a pantser, so if you're someone who doesn't like outlining or brainstorming too much, and you just want to jump straight into the writing itself, that is also perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that you can't brainstorm. It just means that your brainstorming is going to be more like discovery writing. You figure out your world as you write, and it means that you might have like extra revisions because your first few drafts might just be your brainstorming process, but you just approach brainstorming through prose. To give an example that's not like speculative fiction, I wrote a short story, it's probably 2 years ago now, where the catalyst for that story was a certain historical period. So I became really interested in the early 20th century and in jazz history specifically. And so I started looking into like the origins of jazz in Asia, which I didn't know that much about relative to like the jazz age in America. And then I started learning about Philippine musicians and how they learned jazz from American soldiers and how that spread to other parts of Asia like Japan through ocean liners and port cities. I just really like to research the areas that interest me and that get me really excited to write. And even if I'm not actively brainstorming a short story, I think just as a writer, the best thing you can be is curious. And I try to use my own curiosity about random things to just fuel ideas during my brainstorming process. Basically, I think the more that you write, the more you learn about yourself as a writer, and you learn what you're really passionate about, and you kind of begin to understand what really gets your gears going, Okay, next I'm going to talk about character, but I'm specifically going to talk about the relationship between internal and external conflict. Not all short stories will necessarily have a strong character arc. When I was in one of my writing workshops in university, I had a classmate who wrote a sci-fi piece that I think was something along the lines of like someone who photographs or documents apocalyptic settings. Like it's a post-apocalyptic world, and this person is like solo traveling through these apocalyptic settings. So there was no dialogue, there was only one character. It was completely like an internal monologue or something. Very, very detached psychic distance. And the point of the story wasn't the character, the environment was the character. So I bring this up because while most stories will have some character exploration, there are certain narratives and ideas that kind of play with form and tone to the point where character might not be as important. With that said, most of the time you're going to have a character. For me, I think the main difference between how I usually approach my novels versus how I approach a short story is that in a short story, I don't typically think of my characters as having arcs. My writing professor once used the word movement. So how is a character moving through the story? How are they changed? And so that's kind of the question that I always ask myself, is how does the character move? So in other words, how do I ensure that my character isn't staying stagnant from the beginning to the end? Even if they don't fundamentally change by the end of the story, even if their whole life doesn't get turned upside down, have they at least moved from point A to point B? Is anything about their emotions and or their circumstance different? I think the simplest way I kind of think about internal external conflict is that external is the plot, the world, events or issues that are happening to the character, forces from the outside that are affecting the character. Internal is the character's personality, mood, mental, emotional state, their outlook, their values, whatever, and how that's being affected as a result of the external conflict. Another way to look at it, I think, is if you feel like your character is boring, like they're not really doing anything, you can use the basic framework of what does a character want? What is stopping them from getting what they want? If you really want to go into like the nitty gritty of like crafting compelling characters, Lynn actually did a video very recently about character writing, which I would highly recommend because I think her framework is like really simple and applicable to a lot of different stories. But anyways, what I like to ensure is that the main character has some kind of external pressure at all times, something that they're trying to overcome. It writes the plot of the story around how this character either A, overcomes or succumbs to that external pressure, or B, how they have their view or understanding of the world reshaped. So in a short story, at least one thing should change. Either something externally should change or something about the character's like internal mental state should change, or both. So just to give another example, I'm currently writing a short story right now, which is a cyberpunk heist. So to describe the external conflict, the main character is part of a crew that wants to steal something, and they're trying to steal something from a very prestigious place. So the stakes are very high for them. They're committing crimes. External conflict. The internal conflict is that the main character is very anxious about this heist that they're trying to do. He feels like something is going to go wrong. He's going in and kind of nervous. The plot then becomes something does go wrong during the heist, and everything they thought they knew about this place and what they're stealing is turned upside down. The point of internal and external conflict and the relationship between those two things is to create tension and drama. Even if you have a passive character that doesn't actively want something in the moment or doesn't actively want something at the start of the story, the character should at least experience some kind of change, and the easiest way to determine what that change should be is to put an obstacle in front of them and see how they react. All right, lastly, I'm going to talk about tone and theme. I'm going to combine this into one step. These two things kind of go hand in hand for me, at least. So I got an email a few weeks ago from a viewer who I think frames the question of theme very well. So they said, I struggle with refining thematic messages interwoven with a storyline that doesn't feel one-dimensional in terms of like, what tips do I have for helping with this aspect of storytelling in any story, regardless of a novel or a short story? I view theme as the purpose of the story. So the reason that a writer has written this story at all. If you're struggling with a similar issue of like, how do I refine my thematic messaging? I would just start by asking yourself a series of questions to get the juices flowing. Because this is kind of like the unconscious mental process that I do in my head for literally everything that I write, which is like, what do I believe in? What are my values? What am I trying to say about a particular issue? And why am I drawn to this story idea in the first place, to this world, to these characters, right? Like, what is the point of the story? And I think it makes the reader come away with this feeling of like, this is why this story is worth telling. A theme is probably something that all writers think about a little bit differently. So one way to look at theme is also, the core message you're trying to get across, the wider commentary that you might be making about a type of circumstance or about society in general or human nature. Depending on what your theme is, that is going to dictate the tone of your story. And tone is the general feeling or feelings you want your reader to experience. Happy, sad, joyful, angry, uplifting or cynical, melancholic, nostalgic. Obviously, not all stories are going to be these like profound essays on human nature, but every story, even if it's unintentional, is gonna have some kind of theme. Even comedic or unserious stories are probably like, they're gonna have a theme. If you take like a show like The Office, for example, that show's core tone is comedic absurdity, and its themes are around like absurdity as it exists in the context of the monotonous, typical corporate American workplace, and the things that these office workers do to entertain themselves or to find some meaning or solace in their work or in their coworkers, some way to get through the day. Every story is gonna have a theme. So even if you think to yourself, I don't quite know what the themes of my story are, if you just write it, like if you just kind of discovery write it, you can look back and you'll see a theme naturally arise. And if you think that you haven't hit that theme hard enough in revision, you can add more scenes or tweak your lines. So just some more personal examples. I wrote a contemporary fantasy short story last year, and it follows these two like supernatural, I don't want to say they're detectives because they're not law enforcement, but they belong to like an organized group that is tasked with investigating paranormal events, let's just say. And the structure of the story is that they're investigating an abandoned building in a small town. But in order to deal with this growing supernatural threat that is like festering inside of the abandoned building, it requires them to figure out what the history of the building is and what actually happened inside of this building. And so the short story cuts back and forth between this present day investigation and the past, about 100 years prior. So that's the plot of the story. But the thematic pillar of the story is, more broadly about the things that get lost to history, how narratives get twisted through time, and that no matter how many facts are documented, you'll never fully know the stories of the individual people who lived through that time period. So the reason that I brainstorm theme before/while I'm writing the story, and the reason I like to consciously think about it, is because then informs what the ending of the short story is going to be. To spoil the end of this short story, which I don't really plan on publishing anymore, I just kind of wrote it for myself. So to spoil the end of it, the characters in the present day, they never actually learn what happened in this abandoned building. And so the tone of the piece as a result of the theme then becomes more somber and bittersweet. Like it's not as like perfect and happy. If the theme of the story was instead about, the wonders and beauties of history and the things that you can learn about from history, then the tone of the story might have then been more uplifting. And the ending, I probably would have written differently so that whatever the agents learn about this abandoned building helps them solve the mystery in the present day, and they actually are able to dispel the supernatural threat. Two different endings, two different themes. Again, if you're really struggling with like, I don't know if like my themes are really coming across, or I don't know how to interweave theme into my story, really the main thing that I'll say is that you've probably written a theme and you just don't know it. Just go back through the story and think about why your characters are making certain decisions, and what do you want your reader to feel once they get to the end of this. How do you want them to perceive your character? How do you want them to feel about this world? I'm currently writing this sci-fi cyberpunk heist story. I know that I want my reader to come away with a feeling of like just being deeply unsettled and horrified by the prospect of such intense corporate overreach. That feeling of like how horrific it would be to kind of see the types of sacrifices that people would have to make to provide for their families in this specific kind of dystopia. That's kind of what I want the tone of the story to be when I'm writing it, I know that my ending has to hit a beat that reinforces that theme. And again, it's okay if you don't know that yet going into the story. It's okay if you have to like write the story first to figure out what that is. I think the kind of beautiful part about short stories is that they're short. And unlike with a novel, you can kind of go through a lot of different iterations and drafts quicker than you can with a novel. I actually embrace discovery writing a lot more with my short fiction, and I feel like it kind of keeps me on my toes, kind of helps me hone my craft a little bit more, because I can go through a beginning, middle, end a lot quicker without having to like explore it in a whole book, you know? I hope this video was helpful. If you have your own kind of like processes for short stories, feel free to share them below. Just kind of how I think about my storytelling structure in general. Hope all your writing projects are going well, and I will see you guys in the next one.